Hi everyone, my name is Prerak Juthani. I am a resident physician here at Stanford in internal medicine, and today I actually wanted to take you through a long whirlwind tour of my entire ERAS application because I know it's about time to get those in, and last year it was really overwhelming for me. So I'm going to now transition over to the small screen and take you through my entire application, and I hope you find it helpful. Let's get to it.
All right, so here's the final PDF version of my ERAS. I've obviously blanked out some things that are very personal to me and wouldn't be good to have on the internet, but I tried to keep as much unrevealed as possible so that you can understand how it works. ERAS, as you know, is the application that you all will fill out if you're applying to residency. When you actually fill it out on the website, on the ERAS website, you will see that the way you fill things out won't necessarily be the same as the way things show up on the final PDF. So by looking at this final PDF, hopefully you can then back calculate and see where everything that you're entering in, where it will be finally shown to the actual programs when it gets sent out. The other caveat I'm going to give is that obviously everything here is going to be important for different people at different stages of the application. So I'm also going to break down this entire application in the footnotes, and so you'll be able to see every section of the ERAS application. So if you wanted to zone in on publications or scores or whatever, you can go to that section of the application video without having to go through the whole thing. So without further ado, let's get to it. This is the first page of the application. This entire application for me is 13 pages long. It obviously will vary on how long it is for people based on how many things they put in, and obviously what specialties they're applying to and how many programs they apply to. The first page of the application is just the general information, including your name, all your application IDs, including your AAMC, USMLE, NRMP, as well as your gender, your citizenship status, as well as your medical school. They also have your mailing address as well as your phone number. And then they also have some additional questions such as your military service as well as other service obligations. Sometimes people go into residency with a certain level of obligation to the military, for example, especially if the military paid for a certain amount of education. So that's the first page. Let's keep going down here, and you can see that then you also have a bit of your medical licenses, and that happens because some people are applying to residency after they've already gotten their licenses at certain regions, and so if you already have licenses, those would be included here. I personally didn't, but I just didn't want to include any numbers in the off chance that they could be used down the road. They will also obviously ask you about misdemeanors as well as felony convictions. I think that's because every residency program ultimately does a background check for everyone who they end up taking. So this is your chance to just be honest and upfront about those things. Here is the second page here. So you can see that this part is where you have state medical licenses. Again, I didn't have any, but some people may have state medical licenses, and if you did, this is where you would list them. And then we slowly start getting into the relevant parts, which are your medical education. Where did you go to medical school, and how long were you there? So for me, this is my medical school. You can see that I included my general dates that I attended, which was from August 2017 to May 2022. Oftentimes, they will ask you about the degrees that you completed, and if you did an additional year, or if you did an additional degree, you can mention that. So you can say, my medical training was extended because I took an extra year between 2020 and 2021 to get an MBA. Then it goes into the medical school honors/awards. Notice how this is medical school only. So I would focus on awards that you had gotten during your time in medical school and try not to focus on anything in undergrad or high school unless those awards actually happened during the time of medical school. So if you did something in undergrad and got an award for it during medical school, I think that's usually fair game. So you can see here I included a few of my medical school awards, which included scholarships that you may have gotten for financial aid. It can include research fellowships that you've gotten. It can also include awards you've gotten to do research. And so you can see here, these are some of the awards that I got. And you can also see that they will ask you about your AOA status at the school, as well as Gold Humanitarian Honor Society. And what this is all about is certain schools have honor societies for the top X% of their class. And if you're in those honor societies, this is your chance to mention it. But if you don't have those societies at your school to begin with, you can also list that. So for example, Yale did not have any AOA or Gold Humanism Honor Society. So instead of saying I wasn't in those societies, I just opted to say that my school didn't have those societies to begin with, so they know that our school doesn't have some sort of ranking system. And then you also get to include a bit about your education outside of medical school. So here you can see I listed my School of Management, which is where I did my business degree, when you did that degree, what degree you got out of it, And then you can also see it extend all the way back to UC Berkeley, which is my undergrad, as well as the degree I got and the two majors I had at that time. And if you had current/prior training, which includes, I think, residencies, some people do a prelim year and then have to reapply. This is where you would list that. So now the experience section. This is actually where you have a chance to talk about all your experiences, whether they're work experiences, research experiences, and I believe service experiences. You then have 1,020 characters to talk about that experience, and then you also have 510 characters to describe why you left that experience if you want to elaborate on it. Notice that you'll have the organization and location that you'll have to mention, as well as your position, as well as the dates that you did it, your supervisor, as well as average hours per week. I've kind of blocked out my supervisor and hours per week purely for my privacy's sake. The description, I took a general format, which was I described what I did and then ultimately how maybe this experience would have to do with my future plans as a future resident physician. And so you'll see here, you can obviously take a look at the way I talked about it. I don't know if it's good or bad, but this is kind of the approach that I followed. And for the most part, it seemed like an easy format. So describe what you did and relate it to residency and your long-term career goals. Similarly, you'll see here I also included like the fact that I was a teaching assistant. And this is, again, another work experience because I got paid for it. So usually if I got paid for something, I classify it as a work experience. And you'll see that I talked a bit about what I did and ultimately why it relates to my desire to pursue residency, whether that's in the form of me liking teaching or even in the form of the fact that, talking about mentorship as a physician. So now let's just keep going down. And again, a few more work experiences, and I blanked out some of these work experiences, some of them because I'm working on confidential projects. So I did work with med school insiders. Many of you know Kevin Jabal. I worked pretty closely with him. And so I talked a bit about the projects we did there. I've blanked it out here for the sake of privacy. But again, you can talk about literally anything and everything, primarily because it is a way for you to show what you're doing outside of the medical realm. Now, here's another one of the experiences I wanted to talk about. And this one is different because it was actually an internship. Again, I got paid for it, which is why it was a work experience. But I also got one of my letters of recommendation by the chief medical officer of Geisinger. So that's another reason why it was important for me to write this down, because they need to know what I did there from my perspective. So that way, when they see the letter of recommendation that I got from the chief medical officer of Geisinger, they can kind of put those two things together and create a more full picture. You can see here I talked a bit about what Geisinger is, what I did as an intern, and then ultimately what it taught me about healthcare and how I hope that this will help me long term. I noticed that this is the first place where I had a reason for leaving, and I did leave because it was only a 3-month internship. And so for that reason, I did mention the position was 3 months, it ended, and that's why I left. So that way they don't assume that maybe it was a long-term commitment and I ended early. They're understanding that it's a summer internship, and that's ultimately what I had to leave. So here's the next activity, and this one is about being a tutor at the Yale School of Management for the executive MBAs, and I taught game theory and I taught microeconomics just to show them that I love teaching not just about medicine, but also about a lot of very fascinating subjects in my opinion. And so you can see here, this one had to do with the Yale School of Management. The formula for the description was very similar to what I had mentioned earlier, which is, describing what I did and then relating it back to why I think it relates to who I am as a person. The next one that's particularly interesting is this one. Again, I'm not going to harp too much on how I wrote the description because you can see it right there, but I did have a podcast during my time in medical school. It was called Red, White, and Brown. The podcast was about my experiences as a first-generation Desi American, South Asian American in the United States. This has nothing to do with medicine directly, but it had so much to do with who I was as a person and finding myself both through medical school and before medical school, that I felt obligated to include it, not only because we won a lot of awards for it and got a lot of funding through entrepreneurship ventures for it, but also because it's important to show, in my opinion, residency programs, the things that you're interested in outside of medicine. So that way, as they read over your application, they know who you are. And that way, when you actually are able to talk a bit about it during your interview process, they have something to go off of here. So you can see here, I highlighted the whole activity. I also talked a bit about what we're planning to do in the future. And that way, they knew a bit about who I was as a person outside of purely medicine. And speaking on things outside of medicine, notice that I did also include YouTube as one of my activities. That includes this very channel. Again, you can read the description here, so I'm not going to bother hampering on what it is, but I did talk to residency programs about YouTube. I mentioned why I think it's particularly conducive to me, why it's been helpful for me, and more importantly, why I think it's important for medicine more broadly as a whole to embrace YouTube as a form of medical education. I have written research studies on YouTube. I have talked a bit about the spaced algorithm repetition, about Anki and why that works, and a lot of my videos are about Anki. And so all that to say, notice that I didn't just focus entirely on medical related activities. My work experiences talked a lot about tutoring and the traditional form of teaching, but I also talked about YouTube and podcasts, and talked a bit about the fact that I plan to continue to create videos even in residency. So again, by actually including this in my application, I felt like I was giving programs a full perspective of who I was, but also implicitly telling them like, hey, these are the activities that mean a lot to me and I hope to continue doing them. And I hope they mean a lot to you as well, because if not, that might be a disconnect. And so by having these, I knew that any program I applied to would kind of be aware of it. And then, believe it or not, I also included a bit about my organic chemistry board game and the fact that I had created this board game in undergrad, but I was still continuing it in medical school in terms of selling it and also continuing to ship it across the world. And that's why I felt like it was important here. So those were all of my work experiences. And now I'm going to transition over to, I think, volunteer experiences. Because as I said, there's 3 big types of experiences that can be included in ERAS: work experiences, volunteer experiences, and then research experiences. Work experiences are usually things you got paid for or you got money to do. Volunteer experiences are things you usually didn't get paid for, but you still did nonetheless because of whatever interests you have. And then research experiences are research. So now let's talk a bit about volunteer experiences. So this is my first volunteer experience. It's called Health News Around the World. It was this weekly show that we hosted on Clubhouse talking about the biggest health news around the world, fittingly. And this actually had to do with the fact that because COVID-19 was such a big part of 2020 all the way through residency application, this news podcast that we were doing through Clubhouse was a way for us to not only combat medical misinformation, but also keep individuals updated on the most recent trends that are happening in healthcare. It was a really fun experience. It's not happening anymore, but at the time I wrote the application, it was happening, which is why it says March 2021 to present. And I didn't give a reason for leaving because at the time I was still involved. Next, you have additional volunteer experiences, and this is more from my time in business school and the fact that we did a lot of case competitions. I didn't want to talk a bit about the details of both the health news around the world as well as the case competition because there is some confidential information there, both in terms of like intellectual property. Sometimes we're consulting for a big company, and those companies don't like having their information released. And so I didn't describe the case competition here because I kind of blacked it out. But just know that I followed the same format that you've seen all around, which is describe the activity, describe why it was meaningful to you, and then ultimately end by talking about how you think this fits into your longer scheme goal of being a resident physician in whatever specialty you're going to be in. So the case competition was particularly fun because these weren't distinct activities I did all the time, but you did them in short spurts. But you still want to mention it if you thought it was meaningful. And for us, we did get a top 5 in one of the case competitions, and we were semi-finalists in another case competition. So I kind of wanted to show people that, hey, case competitions can be useful, particularly one, because we were doing a lot of healthcare related clients, and 2, it shows people a way that you go about solving problems. And so a reason for leaving, I kind of mentioned that, you know, most case competitions are during certain times, and that's why we didn't do them afterwards. The next volunteer experience is particularly meaningful because this one is a little bit more related to medicine, and it basically has to do with the free clinic we have at Yale. And so you can see here that Haven is Yale's free clinic. I worked there as a senior clinical team member, and I told them directly what I did there, which is taking care of patients who may be uninsured or underinsured. I took physicals, I did labs. I tried to provide them with the type of care that they would get at a normal primary care clinic, and then I also talked a bit about the fact that this primary care clinic we have at Yale, which is a free clinic, is very extensive, and ultimately why it was a meaningful activity for me. Notice that you also have a reason for leaving here. And for me, I've just mentioned the fact that I transitioned into my MBA year, and so I didn't have time to commit to med school at that moment, and so that's why I stopped volunteering at the free clinic. And then under volunteer experiences, I also included a few of the clubs that I was involved in while I was at Yale, including interest groups. Interest groups are things that you do because you're interested in the specialty. And particularly, for example, if you're doing neurosurgery, you might get involved in the neurosurgery interest group. If you're interested in internal medicine, you might get interested in the internal medicine interest group. So you can mention here that what you did in that interest group, the types of events that you held, and then ultimately, again, what you're hoping this will contribute to you as a future resident. Notice that I also talked a bit about different fun projects that I did. So here is about Nerdcore Medical, which is a company that usually creates a lot of board games related to science. As someone who created a board game related to organic chemistry, I just thought it was fitting to mention this here as well, especially because one of the people who I worked with at Nerdcore Medical also wrote one of my letters of recommendation when I applied to MBA. And so it's important for them to know that I have these different connections in different places of people that mean a lot to me and say a lot about who I am as a person. So, all that to say, I'll continue a bit more about the volunteer experiences. I mentioned that I was a primary care provider at Haven. It's called a senior clinical team member, but I also was part of the leadership board at Haven, which is the free clinic at Yale. And so I kind of broke those up into two different activities. Well, I was a leadership position at Haven during my first 2 years at medical school, and I was a senior clinical team member in my third year of medical school. So I broke it up. As you can see, this is my first year of medical school, and then I broke up my senior clinical team member in a separate activity, even though they were under the same underlying free clinic. But notice how the things that I learned and the things that I described were very different in both of them. All right. So now that we've completed the volunteer experiences, next up, we actually have research experiences, which I know a lot of people care a little bit more about. So let's talk about that. All right. So here's my first research experience, and you'll notice that I broke it up into different departments. So the first one was the Department of Internal Medicine, and I just talked about the research experiences that I had in internal medicine. And I talked specifically about the different types of research studies I did. In this one, I talked a bit about the COVID-19 pandemic, and I published 2 research papers that were published in Lancet and Lancet ID and Lancet Microbe. And I talked a bit about the fact that we did a lot of research across different domains, and because it was under internal medicine, it really gave me the flexibility to really focus more broadly on any research experience that couldn't be fit anywhere else. And so that's my first research experience. The next research experience was in the Department of Cardiology, and this was actually one of the summer projects that I did in my second year of medical school, which you can see by the date. Again, I've blacked out the description of this project because it's actually still not done, and more importantly, it actually needs to be confidential. And so I can't tell you a lot about that, but just know that I broke it up by the departments that I worked in. First one was internal medicine. Second one was specifically cardiology, which is specific to one project. And then the next one I had was the Department of Neurology. So you may be thinking, hey, Prerak, you're not even in neurology. How did you swing this? When I started medical school, I was actually thinking of doing neurology because I had majored in neurobiology in undergrad. I like the brain, and so I actually had reached out to a few neurologists, and so I did have a few research projects related to neurology, and they're mentioned right here, and as well as my mentor. Those research projects were eventually published, and I do have publications for them, which we'll go over, but I didn't end up pursuing neurology. But the way that I spun this is the fact that obviously it's always okay to change your mind, and so I said, hey, I was interested in neurology early on, and that's why I did these projects. But also some of these projects had to do with medical education. So I actually spun it in the form of saying like, hey, these projects weren't directly related to neurology. They were more related to medical education, which as of right now is still a very big passion project of mine. And so you can see here I included the names of the mentors I worked with, as well as the types of projects we did. And then I ultimately mentioned why I ended up having to end those projects. 1, because they were already published, but 2, also because I was starting my clinical rotations year. So now that we've finished the research experiences, we're going to talk specifically about publications and the way that I broke those down. So that's going to be the next segment of this video. So now you can see the publications here. They're actually broken down by the way that you categorize them. So there's a lot of categories on ERAS. You can say that you wrote a book chapter. You can say that you did a poster presentation. You can say that you did a speaking presentation. You could say that you actually have a publication. So it's all in order here. So let's start with the peer-reviewed book chapter. I was lucky enough to write a book chapter that was eventually published in a stroke textbook. And so you can see here my name is mentioned right there. And you can also see the details of the citation. And then I actually had a lot of poster presentations. And the way that this works is if you ever go to a conference and you present a poster, you're able to write down that poster presentation here as a sign that you did it, first of all. And this is also why going to conferences is very important. And a lot of people think that conferences can be sometimes silly and tough to do, and they are sometimes a bit more silly, but they're a great way for you to get exposed to the field, meet people relevant in the field, actually write something up that you think is interesting and share it with someone. The best part about poster presentation is that they're much lower stakes than an actual publication, but they also show that you actually did some scholarly work and that you were able to present it in front of a scholarly audience. And so that's why poster presentations, I did a ton of those my first and second year of medical school, and really exposed me to like what research was and how to do it well. And then once I got a lot of poster presentations going, I was then able to convert some of those poster presentations into publications. So you can see here, I mentioned a lot of these poster presentations, and they're listed, and I'm going to spare you the details of like each of them, but you can see them here. Feel free to pause the video. But then you also see that there are oral presentation. What are oral presentations, you ask? Sometimes when you submit a poster for a conference, they will say, hey, this poster seems super interesting. Would you be interested in presenting this orally? And so you can actually say, yeah, I would be. And you can actually then mention oral presentation in the citation. And an oral presentation is different because instead of just standing in front of your poster and presenting the poster, you actually have to present your entire project through like a PowerPoint slide in front of an audience. And one of the best parts of like an oral presentation is that you get feedback, and you also get a much larger audience. And that feedback can actually then help you take your poster one step closer to an actual peer-reviewed publication. So speaking of a peer-reviewed publication, notice that that's the last section here. And these are actual things that are published in the literature in different journals. And so you can see here, I've written about Anki, as I told you all about. I've written a case study about COVID-19. This is another Lancet infectious disease paper about breakthrough infections. And then we did a little bit about psychological attachment styles. So these are all the peer-reviewed publications. And then sometimes I personally did a few non-peer-reviewed publications. So what does that mean? Sometimes you write an op-ed. Sometimes you write something that you think should be meaningful and published online, but you don't necessarily have time to get a peer review. So I wrote a piece on Stat News about medical misinformation, and then I wrote another piece on the AIDS epidemic on USA Today. And so both of those were not peer reviewed because these are op-eds, they're opinion based, but they're still things that I was interested in sharing with residencies, and that's why I wrote them here. And then last but not least, I just have this form of other articles, which if they don't fit into any other category, you can list them here. So those are all of my publications. Now let's just end with some of the last minute details that are going to be included on anyone's application. So the last section of the application just will include the languages that you speak, the language proficiency that you have, and then the hobbies and interests. I cannot overstate the importance of the hobbies, because you might think the hobbies seems useless, but a lot of my interview conversations were based purely on the way I talked about my hobbies. So you can see, like I mentioned, The Office, Breaking Bad, Friends, and I also mentioned taking courses on investing and even watching Steph Curry. So all that to say, hobbies should be everything outside of medicine if you can, because as you notice, everything above is purely related to medicine. You can mention your hometown as well as your other awards / accomplishments. And this is actually where you can mention anything you got outside of college, outside of medical school, I mean. So you can see I listed a few of my Berkeley awards here, as well as awards that I got that are not necessarily directly related to medical school. So hopefully you all found this very helpful. This is my entire ERAS application. If you found this useful, please drop a thumbs up. It really means the world to me. If you need more videos like this, or you want to know more about the publications and details like that, comment below and I'm happy to make additional videos on that. But in the meantime, this is a very long video, so I hope you got value out of it, and I will see you all in the next one. Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Peace.